This is Barclay and Barton on Manchester United with the legendary football writer Paddy Barclay and me, Wayne Barton. Join us as we look at different stories in Old Trafford history. In this series, we are looking at the early years of the Sir Alex Ferguson reign. Please like and subscribe to keep up to date for all the latest content on the channel. Well, there can't be much about the Alex Ferguson era at Old Trafford that went under the radar. Everyone talks about it taking him 7 years to win the league. They talk about Rotterdam, Wembley in 1990, as will we, faithful listener. But arguably this period, the 86 to 88 spell, that's a period that nobody ever concentrates on, Paddy. And in some ways, it's one of the most fascinating parts, isn't it? The digging, the setting down of foundations there.
Yes, it is. In retrospect, and probably also because, you're quite right, it hasn't been given enough attention, and yet it was fundamental to the recreation of Manchester United's Busby glory under Ferguson. All the Busby principles being reenacted by Ferguson, who happened to share them.
You mentioned the state of the squad in the last episode. 1 year earlier than Fergie's arrival, they'd just won 2-0 against Coventry to go 15 games unbeaten at the top of the table. In the season before that, there had been two statements by journalists. John Coates of The Guardian asked, Strachan, Stapleton, Hughes, Olsen, have United ever had a better quartet? And one esteemed writer, not too far from me on this podcast, described Mark Hughes. I'll tell you what though, Paddy, I'm with you on this. Mark Hughes as the most evocative player United have produced since George Best. So tell me a little bit about that, because Mark Hughes is going to be a figure who returns to this.
When Mark Hughes came into the side, he was a different player from the Mark Hughes that we'll all remember from his very long maturity, because he played on at a top level to an incredibly old age for a centre forward, especially one who was willing to have a scrap with anybody who fancied it. But he was a different sort of a player when he was more of a finisher, a marksman. He reminded me slightly of Andy Ritchie, who I think I also hailed as a genius upon his arrival or his emergence at Old Trafford. But Mark Hughes was definitely one that stood the test of time better. But yes, more of a finisher rather than a team player, a shoulderer for the burdens that he later became with United, with Barcelona to an extent, and definitely with Chelsea. So, different sort of player, but I was really, really excited, and I'm glad that quote of mine stood the test of time, and I'm very grateful to you for quoting that one rather than one or two of my less successful ones.
And let's be fair about this, there was not a great judgment call from United to sell Hughes just prior to Ferguson's arrival. It was a controversial decision to let him go to Spain. Frank Stapleton was a fine striker, but he was a 1 in 3 kind of guy and not a 1 in 2, where United probably needed that. When I was working with Clayton Blackmore on his book, he said that for all of Jesper Olsen and Gordon Strachan's qualities, their tendency to deliberate on the ball could often frustrate the forwards too.
Yes.
So 1 year earlier, obviously this quartet were unstoppable, undefeated in 15 games, destined, it seemed, to win their first title in 19 years. We can talk about United's specific problems, as we have done before, because of the size of the club. We did it in the last show as well. I wanted to lay this scene and everything that we just talked about because it puts a little bit of a different perspective on what Ferguson inherited, and also a perspective on the bravery that the manager and chairman showed to sort of give him the opportunity and say, dig new foundations, when it might have been argued that United were close enough, they just needed to bridge the gap. And Paddy, it's a credit to their foresight, and maybe what he sometimes lost is Martin Edwards' love for United and desperation to sort of add what his dad had with Matt Busby.
I think that's absolutely true. I think that when you consider how much stick Martin Edwards took throughout, and overlapping into the Ferguson era for many decisions, but not only decisions, but for his perceived attitudes, which, in my opinion, were a misconception. The idea that he was a public schoolboy with a plum in his mouth and no great love of Manchester United, I mean, it really was nonsense. That he's as big a United fan as you are, Wayne, and you know that, and always has been. But history has I think softened the image of Martin Edwards, and this is a really good opportunity to explain why. Because Ferguson, when he came in, wasn't successful. Bear in mind that a board led by Martin Edwards and with Sir Bobby Charlton on it had parted company with Dave Sexton because although he was reasonably successful in terms of winning matches, the football wasn't very good and crowds were falling. They fell much more sharply in the early years of Ferguson, and yet Edwards had learned enough and knew enough, and with Bobby Charlton's counsel by his side, was enlightened enough to know that Ferguson was building a club as much as a team. In fact, you could say more than a team, because he was. It's not that United's youth system collapsed completely under Atkinson or his predecessors. Not at all. I mean, you mentioned Mark Hughes. He came through that system. So did David Platt. Good player. A distinguished international player with England. So David Platt, unfortunately, for United, was allowed to go to, I think it was Crewe, and then on to Villa and then Italy, and became a sort of world star of a sort. But there was him. There were one or two others who you'll be able to. I mean, Beardsmore, Blackmore. People like that came through. Useful players, not comparable maybe with the other two, but useful players. But Ferguson wasn't just producing useful players. He was laying the groundwork for great players to come through. In fact, it was during this period where you couldn't see any improvement in the first team, and I'm talking about 3 years, the kind of period that no manager would get these days. And certainly, just ask Louis van Gaal, just ask David Moyes, just ask Jose Mourinho. So it really was a different era, and it was an era that was shaped as much in a way off the field by Edwards, Charlton and the board, almost comparably with the way that Ferguson was very much reshaping the club off the field, and bringing in, we talk about Mark Hughes and David Platt as being top players who came through in the sort of earlier eras, but of course neither of those, even great talents, could be compared with Ryan Giggs, who was snaffled away from City in that early period of Ferguson, during which there was nothing exciting about the first team particularly, or nothing that you could tell. But my word, exciting things were happening off the field, and Giggs was the embodiment of that, the first of the Fergie babes, if you like. If Sammy McIlroy was the last of the Busby babes, Giggs was the first of the Fergie babes.
Yeah, although with Giggs being part of the class of '92, and the term Fergie's fledglings, which will come up in a later podcast than this, is obviously came a little bit earlier than the '92 class.
Yes, so the class of '92 was his second wave of youngsters. But I'm glad we're going to talk about the fledglings, because that's. Some of those that was a very unlucky bunch, there were some injuries, but we'll get onto that when the time comes.
In due course, yeah. The top scorer in Fergie's first season wasn't Stapleton or Hughes; it was Peter Davenport. 14 goals. United were a little bit more tough to beat after Alex Ferguson came in, but they lost to eventual winners Coventry City in the FA Cup, so the upset wasn't so bad. And like you mentioned, Paddy, the crowds were going down. 54,000 obviously come for a Liverpool game in April '87. Davenport scores a late winner, but the following game after that, Wimbledon at home, Wimbledon come and win 1-0, and that's in front of a crowd of 31,000. That's the penultimate league game at Old Trafford. The final home game at Old Trafford is in front of 35,000 against Aston Villa.
Those were big crowds compared with one or two of the others that followed a year later, but I'm going ahead of myself.
A couple of heavy defeats as well towards the end of the season. That Wimbledon loss was followed by 4-0 defeat at Spurs. Ferguson seemed to be quite angry towards the end of the season, most often described as Furious Fergie or Fergie Fury. Those combinations would be in the press. Ended the first season, he sold Frank Stapleton. Ferguson's quote was, "He was bordering on the morose," and he sold him to Ajax and said, "We can all laugh a bit now." Indication that he wasn't afraid to make a big change, but also obviously Ferguson renowned for this angry atmosphere at United, but telling that he's trying to make changes to the dressing room atmosphere as well. He
picked his moments. It wasn't there wasn't a permanent hairdryer going on. At times he seemed almost respectful of the players. He was coming to terms with English football. Although he knew the English game a lot, being a student of football, and had travelled at his own expense sometimes to come down and watch games in England from Aberdeen, there were still things that surprised him. Like in Scotland, if you were an elite club, Rangers, Celtic, or in Ferguson's time, Aberdeen and Dundee United as well, there were certain games you would expect to win. And I think it shocked him in England that you could come down here and you could lose to Oxford, Luton, QPR, the supposedly lesser clubs. And I think I think there were certain things about it, even for all his understanding of the game, there were things that took him by surprise. And one thing he resolved to do, and this probably was at the behest, it was prompted by Wimbledon as much as anything else, was to make his team bigger and tougher. You mentioned Peter Davenport, a decent player, and he'd done well at Forest, as indeed had Gary Birtles, a previous capture from that club. But he wasn't as tough as Mark Hughes, say. He was, and this was a theme that went through the team. Strachan and Olsen were mentioned by John Course, and I'll have a word about John Course in a moment. The Guardian's John Course. Those two were little guys, and they could be. I'm not sure if Strachan was easy to bully, but they could certainly be out-muscled, and that was true of Duxbury, of Johnny Sivbeck, and a lot of the players. They weren't intimidating, and I think Ferguson realised that he would need to get a bit more attitude in the team, a bit more muscle, a bit more attitude. Hence, no doubt, we'll talk about the early signings such as Viv Anderson, such as Brian McClare, and Steve Bruce, who perhaps, with his pugilistic appearance, epitomised what Ferguson thought he needed after the first, year, 18 months.
Yeah,
a bit more muscle. But can I just tell you briefly about John Course, because you mentioned him. His quote about have United ever had a finer quartet, and much as I loved John, who I used to work next to at the Guardian, I would probably put Lawbest, Charlton and Crerand up against that four, or indeed Lawbest, Charlton and Tony Dunn. But anyway, yes, John Course was a great lad. He was a United fan, He loved United, and when he wasn't reporting on them on a Saturday, he was in his season ticket. In fact, I don't even think he went in the press box. I think he would report from his season ticket. Talk about reporters with an agenda. But he was he was the features editor of The Guardian in the North. So all through the week, he'd be arranging for such and such a critic to go to such and such a play, or such and such an art critic to go to an art exhibition at one of the great galleries in Manchester, or a play at the Royal Exchange or whatever. And then on Saturday, he'd turn into a raving lunatic Man United fan. He was a lovely man, very, very, very devoted to football in his club, but a real gent, and I was very, very fond of him.
Yeah, and to be fair as well, you don't get to write for The Guardian without being a considered person of judgment, basically, and so I think it speaks volumes about the excitement of that quartet at the time. It wasn't an overstatement. Obviously, it was in retrospect, and you say they can't be compared to those players, but it gives you an idea of how exciting those players were at the time.
It was. I remember once writing myself, of when Strachan had a shot. This was in Atkinson's time, and Strachan had jinked round 2 or 3 people, and then tried a little dink of a chip over the keeper, and it went over, and it was at the Stretford end, and the ball just dropped down onto the crossbar and bounced on the line and bounced out. And I wrote on the Monday that if God had been a football fan, that would have gone in. And Ron saw me the following week, and he said, "Not a bad line, that, son," which was rather flattering.